Hi class, so this week we're covering chapter 4, Single Subject Research. So after reading this chapter, you should be able to describe the advantages and disadvantages of using single subject research, clearly define and operationalize variables to be used in a single subject research design, and in measurable terms. You should be able to list and describe the steps in carrying out single subject research, describe and state the purposes of various single subject research designs, and use Excel to graph and analyze data collected in single subject research. So single subject research focuses on a quantitative approach to documenting changes over time in a limited number of specific elements such as behavior or attitudes. Single subject research is often used to document the process and outcomes of change efforts in a clinical practice or organization. Single subject research answers the question, did change occur in this instance, through considerations of quantitative data. So you're looking at quantitative study of change in behavior over time. It uses a quasi-experimental method. So you observe the behavior, you provide an intervention, and then you observe the behavior after that. So with quasi-experimental, it basically means that you don't have to randomly assign. It means that you don't have to have any control groups. Again, here you're looking at one individual person, but you're measuring them at different points in time. So you're measuring them before and after the intervention. And whether this is an individual person, it could be an individual family or an individual community, you're measuring their changes over time. So when it comes to group level research, they have several limitations when it comes to applying the findings. So there may not be conclusive evidence on the research. So basically that means that they may have different studies out there on a specific topic. However, the results are not conclusive. The results may also show mixed results or contradictory results. The research may not be generalizable to a specific population. So for example, if the studies out there are done with urban foster care children, then you wouldn't be able to generalize that to foster care youth who are in the rural areas. And then even when studies do find consistent results or outcomes, then not all people in the studies show positive results. And usually in these studies, you may have that some of them show no change at all, or some of them even get worse. So there's so many different limitations with previous studies as to why you would need to do a single subject research design so that you can look at the individual person and their individual behavior. So why should we use single subject research? You need to know changes in one individual person. You're not looking for effectiveness of an entire group. So for example, you're looking at whether your client was helped by parent training rather than whether 70% of people were helped by the parent training, right? You're looking at just whether that one individual person was helped. It also provides insight into the process of change. So not just yes or no whenever you're looking at the presence of change. Also, you're looking at no complicated statistical analysis. So with this design, you don't have to do statistics. So it's not very complicated. You're just observing, collecting the data, and observing the results. You don't need a control group, and you can use this with your own caseload. So for people who are working with clients, who are doing clinical work, who are doing one-on-one with clients, this is a perfect way for you to be able to use this on your own caseload. So there also are some assumptions when it comes to using this approach. So the service is a problem-solving experiment. So here you can test the hypothesis between your client's problems and the given intervention. You can provide empirically validated knowledge. You must, however, clearly state your objectives. You also need to make sure that your outcomes can be quantifiable, so basically that they can be measurable. And you also need to make sure your data is displayed appropriately. So single subject research follows the logical steps of a scientific experiment. So through assessment, areas for change, also known as targets, they are identified and goals are established. The hypothesis is that the intervention will change the target in the desired direction. The goals is the dependent variables in research, and they are operationalized. That is, they are defined in measurable terms. This process also includes identifying the short-term objectives that must be accomplished in order to reach your long-term goals. A specific type of single subject research design is selected. So you need to decide on your specific design. Then a baseline phase is established in which the dependent variable is measured repeatedly before the intervention is introduced. So next, your intervention, which is the independent variable, is introduced. After the intervention has been introduced, the dependent variable is measured over time on a regular basis. This step is also known as the intervention phase. Then your data is evaluated using a graph in terms of the desired goals. So following the end of the intervention, data are collected on a follow-up phase to be sure that the individual, family, or community maintains the change with or without continued assistance. So remember, your dependent variable is the goals of the intervention. They need to be specifically and operationally defined, so you need to be very specific about your goals, and they need to be stated in measurable terms. You should be able to measure them. So looking at what will be measured, for example, if we think about tantrums in children, in terms of being measurable, we would look at how often this happens, how many or how much, like how many tantrums do they have per day, how loud or destructive are the tantrums, and then the duration, how long. So how long are these tantrums lasting? And using the valid and reliable scales when available. So if there's a specific scale that's already standardized, you should use those. So for example, if you're measuring depression or self-esteem, there are specific standardized scales that are already available for those things. So instead of creating your own questions and creating your own scale, you should just use one that's already available because it's reliable. You also want to use existing records when available. So if there's existing data, use it. So for example, if you're looking at attendance, check with the schools for attendance records. If you're looking at domestic violence, maybe using domestic violence reports. This is existing records. It's already available. Use those. And then triangulation whenever possible. So triangulation is basically when you use multiple sources or multiple measures. So if there's multiple sources or multiple measures that you can use, triangulation is a good thing to do because it strengthens your research. Okay, so with the baseline phase, it is a series of measurements taken before an intervention is introduced. It is during this phase that researchers establish the pattern of behavior before the intervention. Ideally, during this phase, researchers take measurements until a stable pattern emerges. So a minimum of 5 measurements is useful to establish a baseline. In general, the more baseline measures that we take, the greater the certainty of the pattern. As an example, a baseline may measure the number of times a child has a tantrum when they're told no. The pattern of the baseline can fall into one of 4 different categories. For example, it can be in an ascending, descending, stable, or unstable patterns. So looking at this graph here, we can see that these tantrums, I would say, is an unstable pattern, right? They go up and then down, back up and down. So it keeps going up and down. So it's unstable. So in single subject research, data that is collected in the baseline phase continues to be collected in the intervention phase. The intervention or independent variable should be specified as clearly as possible. So remember, the goals of the intervention is your dependent variable, but the intervention itself is your independent variable. The intervention should clearly establish who will do what, when they will do it, and under what circumstances. So single subject research is not associated with any particular theory, and so it can be used with any intervention approach. Intervention should also, whenever possible, include a follow-up phase. In the follow-up phase, the client demonstrates that he or she can maintain the changes made without assistance from the social worker. So the quasi-experimental design can never prove that the intervention caused the change, but it can strongly suggest it did. So because with the quasi-experimental design, it's basically you have the baseline, then you introduce the intervention, and then you also collect data after the intervention. So you cannot say that, you cannot prove that the intervention caused the change, but it can strongly suggest that the intervention did if you see a change at the end. All right, so now we're going to talk about the different single subject research designs. So there are specific designs that you can select. The first one is the AB design. That's the most simple design. And the AB design measures the dependent variable during the baseline and intervention phases. So the A is used to designate the baseline phase and B is used for the intervention phase. When these data are presented in a graph, a vertical line separates the baseline phase from the intervention phase. So as you can see here, there's a line in the middle, and A over here is the baseline and B over here is the intervention. So looking at this example, we're measuring attendance. And if you can see during baseline, attendance was kind of stable, but looking at intervention, how it went up. So there was definitely a change in behavior during intervention phase. The multiple baseline design is useful in illustrating whether the intervention does in fact account for changes in the target behavior. So although the AB design shows whether change occurs with the introduction of the intervention, the change may be the result of other factors. So other things may have been the result of the changes, such as going back to the tantrum example, maybe the kid matured or the timing of the introduction of the treatment or any other extraneous factors, such as maybe changes in babysitters. Those could have all contributed to the changes in the tantrum behavior. So with the multiple baseline design, we can use two different indicators of change. So we can look at two different indicators, or we can look at two different settings to determine what made the change happen or differences in the behavior. So in looking at this graph, we can see that we looked at two different settings. So we looked at their behavior while they were at home. That's the blue right here. And then we looked at their behavior at school. And if you can see, their behavior at school was way better than their behavior at home. When it comes to multiple component design, this is also sometimes known as the ABC design, and it involves the use of sequential interventions or changes in the amount of intensity of the same intervention. So here we're only using one intervention, however, we change the intensity of that intervention. For example, if we have an anxious 6-year-old girl who was constantly biting her fingernails, her parents recorded the number of times each week that they found her biting her fingernails. Meanwhile, the girl's social worker also used play therapy for 4 weeks. Unfortunately, the intervention produced only limited results. The social worker and the parents then agreed to try a behavioral approach in which they made no comments when the child bit their nails. However, the girl was rewarded for each hour she went without biting her fingernails. So the first time, the social worker was using play therapy, but it seemed like it showed no changes. So then they decided to introduce a different approach, which was a behavioral approach. And so basically, they didn't say anything to her when she bit her nails. However, she was rewarded every time she didn't bite her nails. So looking at the graph, we can see the results for both interventions. So clearly, the girl's nail biting behavior declined far more dramatically after the behavior therapy was introduced. However, we should pay attention that a multiple component design does not specify which component was effective. So now we can't tell whether play therapy was more effective than behavior therapy or vice versa. The only thing that we can conclude from looking at this graph is that play therapy followed by behavioral approach was effective. We cannot determine whether if we continued the play therapy or if we only use behavioral approach that it would have been effective. So based on this, we can't say, oh, play therapy works or oh, behavior therapy works. We can only say that play therapy followed by behavioral therapy works. So an alternative strategy in this case would have been to change the intensity rather than the mode of treatment. So instead of adding an additional intervention, they should have just changed the intensity of play therapy. For example, the social worker could have increased the play therapy to 3 times per week. So in the first case, let's say the social worker was having play therapy once a week. So instead of introducing a whole different intervention, the social worker could have increased the intensity of play therapy to 3 times per week. So looking at here, we can see the baseline. We can see that with play therapy, it kind of went down, right? But then it looks like it was going back up. And then we started behavioral therapy and then it went down. But we cannot prove that we cannot prove that behavior therapy was the one that worked because we had just introduced play therapy. So we don't know if whether the effects of play therapy was just having effects starting here, right? So we can say that play therapy followed by behavior therapy was effective. So just think about the multiple component design. Before adding a second intervention, you may want to increase the intensity of your first intervention. So you would still have A, B, C, and this would be your baseline. This would be play therapy once a week, and then this would be play therapy 3 times a week. So same intervention, just more, or just increasing how often they have play therapy. So researchers use a reversal design to provide greater assurance that the intervention is responsible for the observed changes in the behavior. When using this method, as with the AB design, a baseline phase is followed by the intervention. So with the reversal design, however, the intervention phase is then followed by a third phase in which the intervention is withdrawn. Then the fourth phase in which the intervention is reintroduced. And so this type of single subject design is the ABAB. And we generally use this in drug studies. So first of all, you have your baseline where you collect your data, and then you introduce your intervention. And then the third phase, you take away the intervention. And then the last phase, you introduce the intervention again. So looking at this graph, the reversal design was being used to test the usefulness of meditation for reducing the pain associated with migraine headaches. So in the baseline phase, the subjective intensity of headache pain is charted on a 10-point scale, if you look at it, for 1 week with higher scores representing higher intensity of pain. So first phase, the baseline phase, and then after the 7 days, the intervention meditation is introduced. So after the headache pain is successfully reduced for 1 week, then the meditation is stopped. And in the third phase, the headache pain is again monitored. In the fourth phase, the meditation is reintroduced and the headache pain is monitored again. So looking at the graph, you can see a pattern here. So the client reported a significant decrease in pain while getting the intervention. So looking at the graph, right, baseline phase, you can see their headaches. Looking at the second phase where we introduced the intervention, you can see that their headaches significantly dropped. And in phase 3, when we took away the intervention, you can see that it went back up. And then once we introduced the intervention again in phase 4, we can see that it significantly went back down again. These results strongly suggest that the meditation is a successful intervention for this client. In a reversal design, when the pattern of behavior is increasing or decreasing after intervention is withdrawn and reverts back to intervention levels once the intervention is reintroduced, it is likely that the intervention is the cause of the change. It should be noted, however, that a reversal design does not test the possibility that the meditation had a placebo effect or that any other chance circumstances were responsible for patterns of improvement. So the reversal design may not be appropriate for many social work interventions. First, withdrawing an intervention that was helpful just to test for a reversal effect would be unethical. In addition, many interventions would not have a reversal effect because attitude changes or new behaviors are expected to continue even after services are terminated. For example, a social worker would not expect parents who have learned better parenting skills through parent education classes to return to their former behavior after classes have ended. A changing criterion design, also referred to as changing intensity design, is useful when the goal is to gradually reduce or increase a specific behavior. This approach is often used in monitoring interventions related to withdrawal from addictions to substances such as cigarettes or alcohol. So subphases intervention phase can be numbered sequentially. So each subphase can last for a different period of time depending on when the criterion for that subphase is reached. So if you look at the graph here, we are trying to reduce smoking. And so we're looking at how many cigarettes per day. So basically you would set a goal. So in this case, the client counts the number of cigarettes smoked each day on a paper attached to the cigarette pack. So after the baseline phase, which is A, the client and the social worker establish a goal for reducing the number of cigarettes smoked each day from an average of 16 to 13. So looking at here, we have this client smokes about an average 16 cigarettes per day. That's what the baseline phase shows us. So here in B1, which is we're looking at the intervention phase, the first intervention phase, which is our first goal, we're going to set the goal to 13. So now that they're smoking 16 on average, we're going to set that goal for them to try to reach to 13 on average, right? And so what we would do, we would measure that each day, or yeah, if it's per day, we're looking at that each day. And once we reach the goal of only smoking about 13 per day, then we would set another goal. And then the next goal, let's say we're going to set that goal to 9 per day. And so again, you would measure that again until you reach 9. And after you reach 9, then you would set another goal. So let's say 4. And then you would measure that each day until they get to 4 per day. And then you set another goal all the way until you get to where they're smoking or they're not smoking at all. This can also be done with if you wanted to increase behavior. So for example, if you wanted to increase vegetable intake, if your client has a hard time eating vegetables, and or another thing would be if they're trying to increase how much water they drink per day. Again, this change in criterion design can be used for that because you're trying to increase behavior. So what you'll do for baseline, you would probably look at it and see how many glasses of water they drink per day or how many vegetables they eat per day. And then once you find out the average, then you can set a goal as to how much you need them to take. So for example, let's say they're only drinking about 2 glasses per day. And typically we're supposed to be drinking like 8 glasses a day. So if their average during baseline is about 2 per day, then we can set a goal for maybe 3 per day or 4 per day, right? And once they get to that, then we can set it, all right, now that you're at 4 per day, let's move on to 6 per day. And once they make it to 6, then we set it for 8 per day. So you can use this whether you're trying to increase behavior or decrease behavior. So people may define success of a social work intervention with a single subject in a number of different ways. Some people consider even the attempt to make positive changes as a success. Others may view any change in the desired direction as success, and then others might consider only complete resolution of the problem a success. So sometimes it just depends, right? There's 3 different ways for you to be able to determine success. So clinical social workers are generally interested in therapeutic success, the situation for which a person seeks services or result. So for example, abuse and neglect of a child has stopped, an adolescent is no longer missing school, a nursing home resident is participating in social events, a married couple is engaged in problem solving rather than destructive communication. All of these are looked at by a clinical social worker as their problem has been resolved, and so therapeutic success is achieved when a client has reached the goal of that service. So with experimental success, the intervention has produced a clear improvement, that is, measure in the intervention phase are way better than the average of the baseline phase, but the goal has not been completely reached. In the case of the child who throws a tantrum, the child may have improved from having tantrums every night to only having tantrums once or twice a week. So that's considered experimental success. So you did not reach the goal of having no tantrums, but you did have an improvement. So instead of having tantrums every night, now you're only having tantrums once or twice a week. That's an improvement. So that's considered experimental success. It may not be considered therapeutic success, but it's experimental success. There has been a change. Just like with the cigarettes example, even though they may not have completely stopped smoking, but they went from 35 cigarettes per day to 5 cigarettes per day. So that's also seen as experimental success. There was a change in behavior. So with statistical success, changes in the intervention phase are greater than would be expected by chance variation. For example, if a student missed 16 days of school per month during the baseline phase, but missed only 9 days during the intervention phase, this difference would show statistical success because it indicates a great deal of change from a student's typical or average behavior. So missing 9 days of school each month, however, cannot be considered therapeutic success. Just like with the reduction of cigarettes. So the reduction is greater than expected by chance. So reduction from 35 to 28 cigarettes per day. The change is statistical. There was a change, right? And there may be a significant difference. However, it is not related to improved health. Now, there are different ways to determine success. There's 3 different ways. The first one is eyeballing the data. So with eyeballing the data basically means that you look at the graph and you just determine what you see from the graph. So if you look at the graph, clearly there's no improvement. If you look at, we're looking at school attendance and here's baseline. If you look at it when you get to like week 10, 11, there's really no change, right? It kind of seemed like it went up a little bit, but by week 7, it just dropped. So if you are using the eyeballing method, you can look at this graph and you can determine that this was not successful. So with the split middle method, you plot the mean of each half of the baseline scores and then you draw a line and extend it to the intervention phase. So basically, if points in the B phase, which is the intervention phase, are above or below the line, then the intervention is successful. So if you look at the line here, all of the scores in the intervention phase is above the line. So then you would be able to say that this was successful. This intervention was effective. It was a success. And then we have the standard deviation method. So with the standard deviation method, you would calculate the standard deviation, and if the scores fall 1 or 2 standard deviation away from the mean, from the baseline mean, then you would say it's a success. So there are some benefits and criticisms to using the single subjects research design. So it does promote effective services. You can tell whether something or whether an intervention was successful or not. You can document for your practice so that you can use it with another client. It also promotes research. So especially in the clinical settings, a lot of times they don't do research. And so doing the single subjects research design kind of promotes that research aspect. And you can also combine those individual studies to be able to generalize to a bigger group. And it's a simple process. There's no complicated statistical analysis or anything like that. You don't even need a computer to do it. So it's very simple. However, there are some disadvantages or criticisms about it. They say that it's impractical. Because it takes away time that might otherwise be used for direct services. However, the use of single subject research fits within an evidence-based practice approach where specifying goals, assessing systems, monitoring improvement, and documenting processes and outcomes are integral components of service delivery. The time needed for data collection is often minimal, and the use of computer software makes graphing and analyzing results a fast and simple task. Limited generalizability of results. Again, you're looking at one individual client, and so just because the intervention was effective for that one individual client, it may not be generalizable to others. However, the purpose of using a single subject research is not to generalize that result, is to just change a behavior in one specific person. Another disadvantage is that it doesn't really explain anything, it just kind of describes. And then the lack of adequate time series measures. All right, I think this brings us to the end of chapter 4. Hopefully, this should give you some clarifications and some ideas for your single subject research design project. We will be getting into groups for this project, so I will assign you your group member, and then you guys can get together and start coming up with ideas in terms of your problem and your goal for this research project.